Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Stone Chapel Podcast. My name is David Capes. This podcast is brought to you by the good people at the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center in Houston. It's part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network dedicated to helping church leaders navigate these uncertain cultural waters. You can learn more at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. Josephus is one of the most important Jewish historians of the first century. He wrote nearly 500,000 words during the latter part of his life. Tom Schmidt, himself a historian of the early church, is a professor of New Testament at Fairfield University. He is my guest today. Tom goes back into the testimony of Josephus regarding Jesus and the early Christians, and he comes to some sobering and exciting new conclusions. He's written a book entitled Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. It's being published first in Britain and then in the United States. Tom is a Christian who was not satisfied with how some scholars had read and interpreted Josephus's testimony to Jesus. His book is going to challenge a lot of assumptions and change many minds on the earliest non-Christian witness to the Christ. That's what Josephus is, an early non-Christian witness to the Christ. His website is josephusandjesus.com. Be sure to check it out. Lots of good stuff there. So today, Tom Schmidt on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
My name is Tom Schmidt, and I am Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Fairfield University.
Dr. Tom Schmidt. Tom, good to see you. Welcome. Your first appearance on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
It's great to be here, David.
Yeah, thanks so much. Now, you're going to next year be at Princeton University in the James Madison program, but you just got tenure where you are. That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you. I found out yesterday.
Oh, that's great. That'll lift your spirits, won't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a hard road, but it's a great road for those who are brave enough to go down it, for sure. Hey, for those who don't know Tom Schmidt, tell us, who is he?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying I'm a Christian. I was raised in a Christian family. I didn't embrace my faith till I was 18. I came to college spiritually alone, lost, and I had this encounter with Jesus. It was like darkness to light for me, death to life. And I started reading the New Testament. I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. I wanted to read it in its original language. I started taking Greek, started taking Latin, and then accidentally, I realized I was majoring in Latin and Greek, so I ended up majoring in it. I taught Latin and Greek in the local schools when I graduated. Eventually found my way to Yale University. I did my doctoral studies there in ancient Christianity. I focus on Christianity in Asia and Africa before European colonization, the spread of Christianity there. But I also focus on the New Testament. I publish on that, the formation of the New Testament. And I also have expertise in the field of historical Jesus studies, as they say.
To define yourself as a historian or a theologian or a little bit of both?
More of a historian.
Okay. So you're really interested in understanding the history of early Christianity and its spread, first of all, it sounds like to Africa and Asia, right?
Africa and Asia, yes.
Yeah. A lot of times we think, maybe we'll come back and talk about this on another podcast, we think so much about what happens about Paul going toward Rome and going toward the West. A lot of times we don't know the significance of what happened in Africa and to the east of Jerusalem and Syria and those places.
Yep, precisely. Tell my students that Christianity spread east and south just as quickly and as successfully, even more so than it spread to the west in Rome. There's a lot of remarkable things going on there.
It's a story that we don't know much about, so you can help us, obviously, and there are others that can as well. Now, today we're here to talk about a remarkable book that you have just finished and is being published by Oxford University Press. It's going to come out first in the UK and then later on in the United States. But the title is Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. You have a website, josephusandjesus.com, that we want to direct people to, and they can find more about you and the book and the various projects. Now, new evidence, I'm pretty fascinated by that. I think a lot of people will be. For those who aren't sure, Josephus, okay, I know Jesus, but who is Josephus?
Josephus was born in first century Jerusalem. He was a Jewish priest who then turned into a Jewish general in the war with Rome, who then turned into a Jewish historian. So he had three kind of occupations. And he is how we know most of what we know about early first century Judea and Jewish practices. And he wrote almost 500,000 words. His magnum opus is this book called The Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote it around 93 AD. And in it, he talks about all of Jewish history, pretty much up to his present day. And when he discusses the reign of Pontius Pilate, the governorship of Pontius Pilate, in Book 18, he has a very famous paragraph about Jesus. That is, if authentic, which we'll talk about the controversy over that, but if it is authentic, that's the first discussion about Jesus given by a non-Christian that we have on the historical record. So it's quite famous. Scholars will give it the name, the Testimonium Flavianum, which is a fancy Latin name for just the testimony of Flavius Josephus. And so if you hear that, the TF, the Testimonium Flavianum, it's referring to this paragraph length account of Jesus written by Josephus around 93 AD.
So he's not a Christian.
Correct.
Would you say he's antagonistic to Christians, or would you say he's this, whatever will be kind of guy? What is the disposition?
That's a good question. I think he is not antagonistic, overly so. He may be a little suspicious. He might not like them all that much, but he certainly doesn't seem to have a lot of animosity towards them. Potentially, he could have some curiosity. It's a little difficult to know, but he certainly is not a Christian, and he's certainly not openly hostile. He's somewhere in between.
But being a Jewish general at that time, he was on the losing side.
Yes, he was.
But at the same time, he figured out a way to curry favor with the Romans and to some degree assist them. And so some have called him a bit of a traitor. He kind of switched sides. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it's fair to say he switched sides.
Okay.
His argument would be, I think he'd cast himself kind of like Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is saying, look, the Babylonians are coming and you better get used to it. And I think he had the same attitude towards the Romans, that he felt like this was God's will. He was enormously well connected. He met the empress when he was younger. He became friends with two future emperors. He knew the last king of the Jews, Herod Agrippa II. He was friends with him. He knew high priests. He knew the head of the Sanhedrin. You're talking about a man of enormous connections in the Jewish world and the Roman world. And he settled in Rome around 75 AD after the Jewish War, and he devoted, the last years of his life to writing.
I'm looking at these green volumes that are on my shelf here that are published by the Harvard Classics, and it's a great series. But there's a ton of books, like you said. Yes. Did you say 500,000 words? 500?
Almost, yes,
right.
Almost 500,000 words in a language not his own. Greek was not his first language.
I wonder if he had a good editor, like you and I. We both need good editors.
I think actually he had a team of secretaries who
okay.
helped him. I think he had some royal patronage and things like that.
Well, it helps to start off being well connected and knowing all of these people, because that would put you at a certain level and a certain advantage. In this testimony of Flavius Josephus that you talked about, there is a brief paragraph that deals with Jesus of Nazareth. What does it say exactly? Let's just kind of get it on the table. What does it say first? And second, why is there a question of authenticity?
Those are two very interrelated questions. How the passage is typically translated and interpreted by scholars is an introduction to Jesus, but Josephus says all of these wildly positive pro-Christian things about Jesus. He says he worked miracles. He says he was the Christ. He says he was raised from the dead. He says he fulfilled Hebrew prophecy. And Scholars have looked at that and they've said, well, Josephus was not a Christian. He was Jewish, and we have early evidence from other early sources saying explicitly he was not a Christian. So how can he say Jesus is the Christ? How can he say that he was raised from the dead? So the running theory, the majority position by scholars for about the past 100 years, has been that Josephus wrote something about Jesus in his Antiquities, but a later Christian scribe didn't really like it and changed it and altered it. And that alteration, that contaminated version, spread throughout the later manuscripts. And now today, when we gather all the manuscripts that we have of his book left, they've all been contaminated. And the net result is that we cannot use Josephus as a witness to Jesus or to learn about Jesus because we don't really have his words. That's been the running theory on that. And actually, that's what I used to believe. When I started writing this book, I also thought that. I believed that. I thought that was a very good argument.
It made sense to you.
Yes.
It made sense to you. Okay. Because he wasn't a Christian. He didn't overly speak of that. But when he gets to this particular paragraph, it sounds as if maybe it was written by a Christian. Bear?
Yes.
Yeah. Or certainly it was favorable to, and he's reporting what was being said in his time about Jesus being the Christ, the Messiah, and his resurrection from the dead, those kind of things. All right, so along this way, you changed your mind. What do you think now, and why did you change your mind?
I started looking at how ancient and medieval Greek writers interpreted this passage in Josephus. And what was remarkable was that by and large, they did not seem to be interpreting it like how modern scholars do. They were quoting the same passage, it's the same Greek, but in their discussions, they wouldn't point out any of this stuff. They would just talk about chronology or the nature of Jesus's teaching, the number of his disciples, Jewish culpability in his death. And it just seemed really odd to me that they would do that. Of course, one or two or three of them doing it would be one thing, but there really was a very consistent pattern. I started looking around and trying to see if the words and phrases that are used in this passage are used by Josephus elsewhere. And lo and behold, they are. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of overlapping usages of vocabulary and phraseology that you can find elsewhere in Josephus's work, so much so that it looks like it was written by him. And the further fascinating aspect of this is that when you compare the same words and phrases that you find in the passage with how Josephus uses those words and phrases elsewhere, these phrases don't sound nearly as positive as scholars have translated them to be. And in fact, all of those remarkably pro-Christian claims don't seem quite as pro-Christian. In fact, some of them seem negative. Some of them just seem ambiguous. And the net result is I think, when properly understood and properly translated, is that the passage sounds exactly like something that would have come from a first century Jew who's talking about Jesus of Nazareth.
So maybe the modern scholars, their confirmation bias is coming through. They are thinking and translating that because they were sort of expecting that or something to that effect, that there had been Christians who were monkeying with the text and adding things and making it more pro-Christian. The Christians were involved in transmitting the writings of Josephus, too, at some point.
Perhaps I'll give you just one or two examples of some of this. So one great example is Josephus says that Jesus worked the miracles. It sounds very impressive in English. It turns out that Greek has a lot of different words for miracles. It's got terata, dunamis, semeia, signs, wonders, powers, miracles. But Josephus doesn't use those. He uses the term paradoxa, which even in English that sounds a little odd. And in the New Testament, that's only used one time of Jesus's miracles, and even it's Luke 5:26. But even there, it's a little maybe suspicious. It's said by a crowd reacting to Jesus. And if you look at how Josephus uses that term, he uses that term paradoxa to describe the miracles that were wrought by the magicians of Pharaoh. There's another ancient Jewish source called the Jew of Celsus that's from about the year 150, 140, and it uses the same term to describe the miracles of Jesus, to ridicule them. So all of a sudden, that word doesn't sound quite so positive anymore. There's several other examples of this. Another big one is what Josephus says about the resurrection. He says that Jesus appeared to the disciples alive again. So it sounds like he's affirming the resurrection. But in Greek, it's far more ambiguous. In Greek, the word that he uses is phainomai, and that word can also just mean seem. So you can translate it as he seemed to them to be alive, or he appeared to them to be alive, meaning that they thought he was alive. And so there's many instances of this, but you add this all together and come up with a version, once you calibrate it with Josephus's usage pattern, with a version that describes the life of Christ, but is much more standoffish, is merely describing what Christians and the disciples of Jesus believed, and is not affirming it in a pro-Christian way.
I think you've made a good case here. Inasmuch as it's true, it sort of says something about the scholars who are interpreting it this way in a more positive light earlier, but it also says something about our need to go back and really trace and to look more carefully at what Josephus is saying, particularly in this very volatile text dealing with Jesus. Really fascinating, really fascinating. You have a sense, too, that Josephus is well connected to some of the people who might have seen Jesus, heard Jesus. Not just kind of third and fourth generation, but he knew people before whom Jesus had stood and heard him speak and spoke to him.
Precisely. When I was done writing this book, I sat down to write the conclusion, and I thought, I should probably put in a few paragraphs about where Josephus is getting his information from about Jesus. That would be interesting. A good way to wrap the book up. And before I knew it, I was writing part 2 of the book and, adding 50,000 words to it because what I found astonished me. It turns out that Josephus was born in Jerusalem in 37 AD. His father was descended from high priests and a king. His father was a priest in Jerusalem, and he was 25 years old when Jesus was crucified. Josephus became a Pharisee when he was 19 years old. He lived in Galilee, where he visited Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine. He visited Capernaum. He lived in Sepphoris, 3 miles down the road from Nazareth. He knew all of these places and people that lived where Jesus lived. And just 20 years before, I felt that this is not just a random historian writing in 95 AD or 94 AD. This is a man who grew up in Jerusalem and lived in Galilee just 2 or 3 decades after Jesus walked in those very places. We should pay attention to what he has to say about Jesus. I'll give a clue to your readers.
Okay.
That presents several different arguments. In the passage about Jesus, he says that it was the first men among us who accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate. And he uses that word, the first men. And when you read Josephus's autobiography, he wrote, many things. And he wrote an autobiography about himself. And in this autobiography, he repeatedly says, I knew the first men. I knew the first men of Jerusalem. And he says this starting in 51 or 52 AD. Same term, same group of people. Clearly in the same circles as those who he claims accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate.
Wow.
What I do is I do a social network analysis where I try to track down who did Josephus know and can we place them at the trial of Jesus. And there are about 11 candidates that it's possible to place there.
Unbelievable.
The likeliest candidate is Josephus's commanding officer in the Jewish war. Josephus was a general. He was one of 7 generals appointed to fight the Romans. And then above him were two supreme commanders, and one of them is Ananus II, who was also a high priest. And Ananus II, Josephus tells us, was the one who had James, the brother of Jesus, executed. So, in other words, Josephus knew the man who executed Jesus' brother. Ananus's brother-in-law is Caiaphas, and his father was Annas, both of whom are the high priests the Gospels describe as putting Jesus to death. So Josephus knew the man whose father and brother-in-law put Jesus to death.
Wow.
Which is a remarkable connection.
Yeah, and puts him right there up close to those key people.
Yeah.
Wow.
The question I think some of your listeners might have is, can we place Ananus II, Josephus' commander, at the trial of Jesus? Is it possible to do that? And I think it is, actually, for two reasons. One is that Josephus tells us 3 times that Ananus II was extremely old in 68 or 69 AD. So he would have been in his 30s when Jesus was crucified, when his father was high priest and his brother-in-law was high priest.
Yeah.
The Gospels say that all the chief priests were at the trial, which suggests that this future high priest would have been there. But the real evidence is that Jesus was crucified on the Passover. And on the Passover, all faithful Jews, according to the Torah and according to the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud, they were supposed to go to Jerusalem. It was a pilgrimage feast, and they're supposed to eat a sacrificed lamb in the house of their father. And they're supposed to spend the night at the house. And this was to remember when the Israelites ate the Passover lamb and stayed in the house over the night while the destroyer passed over them back in the Exodus. Well, you know what that means, that Josephus' commander would have been in Jerusalem on the Passover of Jesus' crucifixion, and he would have been in his father's house. And where do the Gospels say Jesus was brought? They say that on the night of his arrest, he was brought into the house of Annas, the high priest, who is the father of Josephus' commander.
Wow.
You could make the very plausible argument that Josephus' commander would have been required by law to be in his father's house at the same time that Jesus was brought there for trial.
Man, that's fascinating. Fascinating. And this is, as you say on the cover of the book, new evidence that you're pulling out and that we're seeing. How did we miss this before?
I think people didn't think too much about it. They accepted the general narrative. But one thing that unlocked this was new Greek databases. I leveraged some Greek databases to do systematic searches, word searches, to find these parallels in Josephus that scholars have not been able to find before. And that unlocked new meanings, realizing that this passage is not as positive as previously thought. And it also allowed me to find those links that when Josephus says that the first men had Jesus accused before Pontius Pilate, he also says, I knew the first men elsewhere. And that can be obscured in English translation.
Sure. Yeah.
You run these searches, you start realizing these things.
Wow. Well, the book is entitled Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. Fascinating book. Published by Oxford Press. Tom Schmidt, thanks for being with us today and giving us a hint. It's what some of this new evidence looks like on the Stone Chapel podcast. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, David. Thank you for inviting me.
Tom's book is going to reset the agenda for how we think about first century Jewish history. Josephus didn't have a front row seat at the trial and execution of Jesus, but he knew those who did. The website that for Tom's book, it once again is josephusandjesus.com. Be sure to check that out. Thanks to Kathy Capes, our audio editor. Thanks to Phil Keggy and me for the music. Jessica Mauser and Janet Firestone help us produce this podcast. Big thanks to them. Ed Stetzer is the grand poobah of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. Always grateful to him. He's coming to Houston with some of his friends to talk about the state of the church. big free public event. Hopefully you'll come and join us. Watch for our newsletter and check out our website, laniertheologicallibrary.org. If you like this podcast, please give us a 5-star rating, 555, and tell a friend. Till next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.